Few aircraft in history are as controversial as Lockheed Martin's Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35 Lightning II. This aircraft, projected to cost the US more than $2 trillion over its 6+ decades of service, saw repeated cost overruns, production delays, and technical setbacks over the 17 years since it first took to the sky. And today, you don't have to go far to find someone calling this seemingly troubled fighter a failure. It seems like a week doesn't go by without another slew of headlines about F-35 production woes, budget-bashing overages, and worst of all, F-35s falling out of the sky. But what if I were to tell you that you've been lied to? That a combination of bad media practices, cognitive biases, and even foreign disinformation campaigns have colluded to shape your perceptions of this aircraft in the worst possible light? What if the F-35 wasn't a failure at all, but was in fact one of the most successful aircraft programs in all of history, despite its very real list of shortcomings? Let's talk about how the media has lied to you about the F-35, how our swollen monkey brains struggle to contextualize reality, and how Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns have created unrealistic juxtapositions about the most advanced fighters in service today. Because it's time we put this myth to bed once and for all. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Last week, we talked about a Russian Su-35 performing an unsafe and unprofessional maneuver in front of a US Air Force F-16, while the American fighters were intercepting a pair of Russian nuclear-capable bombers and their fighter escorts off the coast of Alaska. And you guys know what time it is. I want to talk about ground news and why it's not just an excellent tool for staying on top of what's going on in the world, but it's also a great way to see how an outlet's interests and biases can affect the way they present the news to you. And nowhere are these comparisons more stark than when looking at the imperfect free press of the Western world as compared to the strictly controlled Russian state media. Here in the coverage details, I can see that 129 news outlets covered this story last week. And when you scroll down, you can see every instance of this story being covered, including the headline, whether or not that outlet is state affiliated, its political bias, its ownership, and even its factuality rating. With outlets like Russia Today using headlines like, "Watch Russian fighter jet push US F-16 away from nuclear bomber." But literally right beneath it, and with the same political leanings, I can see coverage out of France and India, running headlines like, "A Russian fighter flies dangerously close to a US Air Force F-16," and "Close shave, Russian fighter jet flies dangerously within feet of US F-16 near Alaska." These headlines, as you can see, present a very different perspective. But one of my favorite tools that ground news gives me isn't just about holding news outlets accountable, it's about holding me accountable for my own media consumption. And that is the My News Bias portion of their website, which gives you a breakdown of what types of content you consume and what types of biases that might expose you to. Right here on the My News Bias page, you can see that of the roughly 100 stories I've used ground news to review recently, 32 of them came from left-leaning outlets. 30 came from right-leaning outlets, and 41 came from centrist outlets. I can see what percentage of these news outlets are independent versus which ones are media conglomerates, and so much more. And if you want to get in on this, just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Lockheed Martin's F-35 Lightning II is the most technologically advanced and broadly capable fighter in the sky today, thanks to an immense amount of onboard computing power, sensor-fusing avionics, and supremely low observable design. Born out of an acquisition boondoggle that saw repeated cost overruns and technical setbacks, the F-35 program has been the rightful recipient of lots of criticism over the years. But as we've discussed several times on this channel in the past, many outside the know often mistake the F-35 program's budgetary woes for meaning the aircraft itself doesn't perform as advertised. In fact, one could argue that few aircraft in history have suffered this sort of reputational sabotage in both news and social media that the F-35 has, largely due to three specific things: sensational headlining practices born out of our modern attention-based media business model, good old-fashioned recency bias, and a lack of comparative transparency in foreign stealth fighter programs to form a basis for comparison. And let's start with one I have personal experience with, and that is the financial incentive to push bad news. I've been in the defense media game for a while now, and I can personally attest to the fact that there are some topics that are just guaranteed to drive a ton of clicks, views, comments, and shares. And one of those sure things is an article about something going wrong with the F-35 program. Of course, this negativity bias is not unique to the F-35. When I took my first college journalism courses nearly 20 years ago now, man, that hurts. One of the first things they taught me was the saying, "If it bleeds, it leads," an axiom sometimes attributed to William Randolph Hearst all the way back in the 1890s, about how headlinings emphasizing death, destruction, or woe will always sell more papers. Our collective preference for bad news has been quantified more scientifically as recently as 2023, when a group of researchers from universities all around the globe came together to analyze 105,000 news stories that resulted in 370 million impressions and 5.7 million clicks. In other words, 370 million people saw these news stories, and 5.7 million of them clicked on them after. And this study confirmed that indeed, and I quote, "negative words in news headlines increase consumption rates, and positive words decrease consumption rates." In fact, according to their findings, each additional negative word added to a headline resulted in a 2.3% increase in click-through rates, or the ratio of overall people who saw the headline versus the number who actually clicked on it. And for a bit of inside baseball from a guy who runs a digital news outlet, a click-through rate of just 2% in all is generally considered to be pretty good on search engines like Google, meaning the addition of just one negative word to your headline could double the number of people who actually click on your article or more. Now, this will have a massive impact on the ad impressions you're able to deliver, or in other words, the amount of money you can wring out of each article that you publish. And there are actually several other ways that traffic benefits your site, but let's not go off on a tangent. Suffice to say that while the F-35 program has had more than its fair share of controversies, there's also a clear financial incentive for both news outlets and content creators alike competing for your attention to frame every story in the worst possible light. So if you find yourself feeling pretty crappy or pessimistic after an hour of scrolling on your phone, now you know why. It's because selling doom and gloom is the easiest way to make a buck in the media business. And this plays directly into the second factor shaping perceptions of the F-35 as America's airborne problem child: recency bias, sometimes known as availability bias or the recency effect. This cognitive bias speaks to our inherent human habit of placing a greater emphasis on things we've been exposed to more recently, especially in cluttered and muddled informational environments. You'll often see people saying that the F-35 crashes often, for instance, despite having one of the best safety records of any fighter in the modern era. In fact, the F-35 averages just 1.6 crashes for every 100,000 hours these jets spend in the sky, less than half of the F-16's lifetime average of 3.55 crashes for every 100,000 flight hours. But headlines about F-35 crashes drive lots of traffic, and today, most people don't recall the F-16's troubled early years, where between 1975 and 1993, the legendary Viper suffered more than double the branch average for aircraft losses. In fact, between fiscal years 1988 and 1994, an average of 17 F-16s were lost per year, for an average of 4.2 airframes lost for every 100,000 flight hours. Now, none of this is to say that the F-16 is a bad aircraft. In fact, it's the most successful fourth-generation fighter on the planet in terms of production numbers and total operators. Instead, this comparison is meant to highlight how far off perceptions of fighter programs can be as a result of media hyperbole and recency bias. The F-16 is an objectively successful program, with over 2,100 fighters still in active service today all around the world, more than any other fighter on the planet. But the F-35 is not only objectively safer, it's already among the most widely operated fighters in the world as well, with more than 1,000 airframes out there right now. This availability or recency bias also applies to readiness rates, which are the subject of lots of F-35 related headlines. It's been widely reported that only around half of America's F-35s are considered ready for a fight at any given time, a figure that is widely reported without any other context from the 96-page Government Accountability Office report that this claim comes from. That report, however, highlights precisely why F-35 readiness rates are so low and how exactly the DoD plans to fix them. Put simply, it has little to do with the F-35 itself and is instead a question of completing the slow construction on repair depots meant to sustain these fighters for the coming 60 or so years. Or, as the report states, the analysis projected that if DoD achieved planned depot capacity, the air vehicle availability rates of the F-35B and C would be close to 65%, while the air vehicle availability rate of the F-35A would be close to 75%. But here's the thing, most Americans lack the context to know whether even 65 to 75% readiness rates might be any good. So to give you the context that almost all coverage leaves out of this discussion entirely, readiness rates of 65 to 75% would place the F-35 fleet on equal footing with aircraft like the supremely reliable A-10 Thunderbolt II or Warthog at a 67% fleet-wide readiness rate in 2023, or the F-16C at 69%, while significantly outperforming air superiority fighters like the F-15C that sat at an abysmal 33%, or the F-22 at 52%. In fact, despite all the headlines you've almost certainly seen about F-35s not being ready to fight, you might be surprised to learn that in 2023, the most recent year with publicly available figures, the Air Force's F-35A fleet still had a higher mission-capable rate than a wide variety of other aircraft that have been in service for significantly longer, like, again, the F-15C, to bombers like the B-1B Lancer, and even cargo planes like the C-130H and C-5M Super Galaxy. That is to say that while F-35 readiness rates do have lots of room for improvement, a good portion of that issue is simply the construction of maintenance infrastructure that already exists for older fighters like the F-15 and F-16. And despite being significantly more technologically complex and the inclusion of maintenance-heavy elements like radar-absorbent coatings, the F-35 is projected to outpace older, easier-to-maintain jets in terms of fleet readiness once those facilities are complete. There is nothing wrong with holding the F-35 program accountable for things like readiness, but the context that we would need to actually really appreciate these figures is intentionally left out for the sake of a sexy headline. But that's not the only problem. Because even then, we're largely comparing the F-35 program to mostly fourth-generation fighters, or aircraft with completely different mission sets. And in order to really assess whether or not the F-35 program's woes are unheard of or inappropriate, we would need to compare it to other fifth-generation fighter programs specifically. And that is a problem. Because the combination of media sensationalism and recency bias also feeds directly into the third facet of the F-35's reputational conundrum, something that I like to call the transparency gap between adversary nations, in this case, adversary nations operating fifth-generation fighters. Despite the F-35 program being an international effort right from the onset, the US has led the program throughout, pulling from decades of research, development, and operational experience producing and flying low observable aircraft, starting with the F-117 in 1983, continuing with the B-2 in 1997, and extending further with the F-22 Raptor in 2005. Today, the F-35 is one of just 4 operational fifth-generation fighters on the planet, sharing that unique distinction with America's F-22 Raptor, China's Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon, and Russia's Sukhoi Su-57 Felon. And while these fighters are often discussed on a one-to-one basis in online discourse, with debates about who would win in a fight between one fighter and another, that discussion itself, to some extent, is predicated on ignoring the F-35 program's greatest success, its production numbers. And that isn't by happenstance. Now, there have been more than 1,040 F-35s of all variants delivered to 10 different nations across 33 different air bases, including an American fleet of now more than 630 of these advanced jets. This represents not just the largest fleet of stealth fighters in the world, but the largest number of stealth aircraft ever produced. America's F-22 Raptor, of course, saw its production halted after just 186 airframes were delivered, with only around 150 actually carrying the requisite systems for combat. To date, Russia has taken delivery on maybe 25 or so serial production Su-57s, including 2024's dramatic reduction in production numbers due to ongoing sanctions. None of these aircraft, it's worth noting, are powered by the platform's intended fifth-generation turbofan engines, and instead, they all carry older AL-41F turbofans, also found in Russian fourth-generation jets like the Su-35. China's Chengdu J-20, on the other hand, has seen significant production numbers in recent years, with some estimates placing the overall J-20 fleet strength at north of 250 airframes, and a recent satellite analysis conducted by Janes suggesting that around 195 of these jets are actually operational. Like the Su-57, most of these J-20s also carry dated fourth-generation engines, starting with the Russian-sourced AL-31, followed by multiple iterations of the Chinese equivalent WS-10, and the first images of a prototype J-20 flying with its intended fifth-generation engine, the WS-15, only surfacing in September of this year. That is to say that even calling China's J-20 and Russia's Su-57 peers to fifth-generation fighters like the F-35 and F-22 is debatable, as both Russia's and China's efforts have yet to produce truly complete fifth-generation aircraft, and instead, both airframes still carry dated, less efficient, less powerful, and easier to detect turbofan engines. But even barring that consideration, the United States alone operates more F-35s than all of the stealth fighters in Russian and Chinese service combined. And the sheer number of total F-35s out there outstrips even the combined total of all other stealth aircraft ever built by all nations, including the US, throughout all of history. And because of the number of F-35 airframes in service and F-35 operators around the globe, that also means the F-35 has seen more combat than any other stealth fighter. The F-35 flew its first combat missions for Israel in May 2018, followed by the U.S. Marine Corps in September of the same year, the U.S. Air Force in April of 2019, and for the UK a few months later in June. And while these missions were not all flown against integrated air defenses like the platform was designed to beat, these missions still reflect both the platform's maturity and, just as importantly, rapidly maturing doctrine built around leveraging these aircraft in actual combat. And the F-35's combat experience hasn't even been limited to air-to-ground operations, with a U.S. Air Force F-35A downing an Iranian drone over Syria in February 2023, and an Israeli F-35I successfully shooting down a Houthi cruise missile in November of the same year. Comparatively, the J-20 has yet to see any combat whatsoever, and despite lots of Russian claims, the best evidence we have of the Su-57 seeing any real action is a video that's believed to show the fighter downing its own wayward drone wingman over Ukraine earlier this month. But discussions comparing the F-35 to its fifth-generation peers often intentionally skip right past the platform's massive numerical advantage and its combat history, not to mention what are all but certain to be similarly lopsided figures for things like total flight hours, which for the F-35 currently sit at more than 922,000, or trained pilots, which again for the F-35 now sits at more than 2,630. And just as importantly, trained maintainers, where the F-35 program now has more than 17,060. The fact of the matter is, the F-35 program is a stealth juggernaut in the sky, but legitimate comparisons between fifth-generation fighter programs are exceedingly rare, for one specific reason. America is very open about the F-35's successes and failures, while Russia and China carefully curate any public discussion regarding their own advanced fighter programs. If you want to argue that F-35 readiness rates are low, for instance, a reasonable counterpoint might be, okay, then how does F-35 readiness compare to other fifth-generation fighters? After all, it's much more logical to compare F-35 readiness to other aircraft designed with similar stealth attributes, advanced sensor-fusing avionics, maintenance-heavy radar-absorbent skin, and fairly immature production and maintenance facilities. We can compare F-35 readiness to the F-22 Raptor at 51% and 52% respectively in 2023, but we can't compare either to China's J-20 or Russia's Su-57 because, well, neither of those nations discloses their readiness rates. We can assess pretty reliably that Russia has around 24 serial production Su-57s based on their own public claims, satellite imagery, and following the massive logistical tail of advanced fighter production. But overhead imagery can't tell us how many of those fighters are actually ready to fly, let alone fight. Likewise, China does not disclose how many J-20s they produce per year, how many are in flyable condition, or even overall fleet strength. We can assess via satellite imagery that today, China operates J-20s in at least 12 air brigades spanning the nation, and may be building as many as 70 airframes per year. But again, how many of those jets can fly is a mystery, and how many can fight is an even bigger one. Some production woes simply can't be hidden, like these aircraft continuing to fly with dated fourth-generation engines that are clearly visible in any images taken from the top, bottom, sides, or back. Others, however, are really easy to hide. Take the F-35's recent issues with its TR-3 upgrade, which saw a slew of new hardware and systems integrated into new aircraft meant to support the upcoming and significant Block 4 upgrade. For a year, F-35 deliveries were halted, with dozens of these fighters piling up at Lockheed Martin facilities, waiting for the kinks in these new systems to be ironed out before deliveries could commence again just last month. Because of American transparency, this issue has seen a ton of media coverage and lots of discussion, highlighting yet another setback in F-35 deliveries. But if this same issue were present in China's J-20 program, for instance, nobody in the West would know. We would just see aircraft sitting on the runway at production facilities as numbers continue to climb. But because software issues aren't visible from space, we'd have no reason to conclude that those jets weren't operational, or at least it would be safer to assume that they were. Now, this isn't my first day on the internet, so I know that right around now is when people start sounding off in the comments about how Western media is all propaganda and has a significant bias in favor of American military efforts. But that perception is simply not a reflection of reality. Few stories sell better than holding the DoD's feet to the fire. And this whole narrative doesn't acknowledge the fact that the wild conspiracy theories that people often attribute to American media are actually objectively true about Russian and Chinese media. America's politically toxic and deeply divisive media industry is far from a model for a reliable, factual, or truly free press. While American media coverage is not actually dictated by an Illuminati-like conspiracy, it is dictated by the unrelenting pursuit of profit, which has resulted in politically partisan outlets catering to the beliefs of their target demographics in order to serve them advertisements, rather than any kind of an effort to inform people. But as flawed as this system is, it is a system born out of our own consumption habits, and one that can be similarly improved through the same. If we simply stop engaging with bad journalism, it would make good journalism the more profitable model. But China, on the other hand, is recognized by the Council on Foreign Relations as the world's most restrictive media environment, and is listed by the Committee to Protect Journalists as the world's most prolific jailer of reporters. And while people will claim American media is controlled by a secret cabal of deep state actors, China's openly is. In 2016, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited the nation's 3 largest news organizations, where he very openly said the quiet part out loud. I'll quote him directly. "The media run by the party and the government are the propaganda fronts and must have the party as their family name. All the work by the party's media must reflect the party's will, safeguard the party's authority, and safeguard the party's unity. They must love the party, protect the party, and closely align themselves with the party's leadership in thought." China's use of carefully curated narratives that only portray Chinese efforts in a positive light ensures information about setbacks, failures, and other issues related to high-profile programs like the J-20 simply never see the light of day unless word somehow slips past their censors. And like most intelligence and influence operations, Russia's efforts are similar but more heavy-handed. Not only are most large media outlets in the nation government-owned, but Russia also has a history of imprisoning and even killing journalists, and even everyday citizens, for stepping outside the bounds of approved narratives. In fact, in 2022, Russia even passed legislation allowing the state to sentence any individual with up to 15 years in prison for crimes as insignificant as calling their ongoing invasion of Ukraine a war. This carefully censored media landscape is then bolstered by widespread international disinformation campaigns meant to exacerbate negative perceptions of all things Western, especially military endeavors. These campaigns extend well beyond the troll farms and bot comments we've all grown accustomed to, and now include things like hosting elaborate spoof websites meant to fool unexpected users into thinking they're reading articles on established news outlets rather than Russian or Chinese-sourced propaganda. These and similar campaigns are present across all major social media platforms, including Twitter or X, Facebook, and right here on YouTube, but are also found all across smaller communities, in forums, and elsewhere online. And these campaigns don't come in the form of press releases. They come in the form of seemingly organic interactions with individuals who seem to be just like you. They come in the form of memes you see shared on Reddit and hot takes that people parrot all across social media. Remember, truly successful influence campaigns don't invent narratives out of thin air. They identify narratives that exist, ones that could sow discord in the populace, and they exacerbate them. They pour fuel on the fire. And if you find yourself wondering, well, what does this airplane nerd know about influence campaigns? You should know that narrative warfare was my beat before aerospace. I've even written a book on this topic, and that doesn't make me an expert, but I do know at least a thing or two about it, thanks in no small part to support I've received from folks like Dr. Ajit Maan, founder of Narrative Strategies, a DC-based think tank, and the author of the book Narrative Warfare, which I highly recommend. In fact, I leaned heavily on my background covering information operations in my coverage leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where I repeatedly published stories about how the West had an exaggerated sense of Russia's military capabilities born out of bad media practices right here in the Western world. Heck, 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine, I published a story on Sandboxx News entitled How Russia Uses the Media to Convey a False Image of Military Prowess, outlining how Western fears of Russia's conventional military forces were born out of media manipulation and smoke and mirrors. These influence campaigns are real. They're out there, and you can spot them if you're looking. Now, the audience for this series in particular tends to be exceedingly well informed, especially when it comes to all things defense. But the average person out there, just trying to get through their workday, make dinner, get their kids cleaned up for bed, and then perusing social media once in a while to see what's going on in the world, aren't aware of these influence efforts and this transparency gap. As a result, they compare the frequent headlines they see about F-35 crashes, F-35 readiness rates, F-35 cost overruns, to sensational headlines about the threats posed by China's rapidly expanding fleets of stealth fighters, or Russia fielding advanced new engines for theirs. As I've described it in the past, the public is effectively stuck comparing the F-35 program's whole iPhone photo reel, complete with unflattering selfies and blurry accidental shots of the bathroom floor, to China and Russia's carefully curated Instagram profiles. And just like a teenage girl looking at pictures of Kim Kardashian and wishing her lips could look like that, Americans see headlines about growing J-20 threats and wish their F-35 was progressing as smoothly. When in reality, Kim Kardashian is a woman in her 40s who uses her immense wealth and media influence to try to look like she's the teenaged girl, using smoke and mirrors and maybe a bit of Photoshop to present the image of perfection, even in the absence of it. And unfortunately, whether we're talking about Kim Kardashian or stealth fighters, American media has a financial incentive to buy into these sensational fictions, because reality rarely breaks the internet quite like a well-edited bikini picture, or a hyperbolic headline about an unsubstantiated claim about Russian or Chinese military capabilities outstripping that of the US. The hard truth of the matter is, the F-35 program is, and always has been, riddled with wasteful spending, short-sighted decisions, blatant errors in judgment, and unforeseen technological challenges. I want to be clear that I'm not disputing any of that. But the scale and severity of these very real issues is often presented without the necessary context, because that context is often hard to come by, and to be frank, just won't sell nearly as well. And while the F-35 program continues to face challenges, it's important that we remember that this aircraft was designed to do things that no operational fighter in history had ever done before. That it brings technologies to bear that adversary fighter programs are still years away from putting into production even now, nearly 2 decades after the first F-35 took flight. The F-35 is not a perfect jet. In fact, Every aircraft that's ever made it into production has come with a long list of compromises. But the pervasive idea that the F-35 is a failure isn't the result of its actual performance. It isn't based on reports from those who fly it or those who maintain it. And when we do discuss the program's real issues, we often do so without finding any basis for comparison whatsoever, in no small part because there has never been another stealth fighter program of this immense scale, with this degree of success in foreign markets, or with this breadth of operational experience. The F-35 Lightning II isn't just the most technologically advanced stealth fighter ever to see service. It's also the most successful stealth aircraft ever to see production. The first stealth fighter ever to serve on an aircraft carrier. The first operational fighter ever to fly supersonic and then land vertically. The first fighter ever to be capable of flying its own electronic warfare support. The first stealth fighter to integrate an all-seeing helmet display with a distributed aperture system. The fighter carrying the most powerful turbofan engine ever affixed to a tactical aircraft, carrying the most powerful radar array ever installed in the nose of a fighter. And the list goes on and on. The F-35's combination of stealth and sensor fusion, more so than even the F-22 Raptor, represents a pivot point in combat aviation, where we prize technological prowess over brute force capability, and that alone robs it of some of the cool factor that you can feature in videos and articles about the twin-engine F-22, Su-57, and J-20. And make no mistake, cool factor matters. It not only drives clicks, it shapes perceptions. But all the views in the world won't win you a war. And winning wars is what the F-35 is really all about. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. I've been on the road for the past 2 weeks, and I've got a lot of great stuff to go over with you guys. I just need to get settled in my office again first, so stand by for that. And until then, make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com each and every day for the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.